don't know me, my name is Dale, and I'm one of the elders at New Life Community Church. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover this morning. I'll probably mention that again as we go, but I'm going to jump straight in, really, to our preaching series, our ongoing preaching series, which is based in the book of Exodus. And this morning we are going to look at Exodus chapter 16. But before I get stuck into that passage and start unpacking it with you, I want to do a little bit of introduction, a little bit of context. Last week we had Simon Redmill who came and preached to us from Grace Church, and that was amazing. What a wonderful message and time that was. But actually he didn't deliver out of Exodus. So in case you weren't here, or in case your mind has kind of forgotten some of what we covered, here's a little bit of context. So God has heard the cry of his people Israel, who were in slavery in the land of Egypt. And he's raised up a man called Moses to lead his people out from under the brutal regime of Pharaoh. And as part of that process, through a series of plagues, God has demonstrated his power and authority over Pharaoh, his people, his lands, and his gods. And then finally, after executing his judgment on the Egyptians and safeguarding the Israelites through the blood of the lamb smeared on their doorposts, God has led his people out of Egypt towards the land he promised to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Instead of taking the direct route, though, to this promised land, God has taken them a different way. Because he knew if he took them directly there, they would go right through the land of the Philistines, who are an incredibly warlike people. And he knew that they were not ready for that kind of confrontation at this point. So in going the other way, they've arrived at the Red Sea, which seems like an impenetrable barrier that traps them between its banks and some pursuing Egyptians, the whole pursuing Egyptian army. But then God parts that sea. He backs up the water on both sides, and he allows the Israelites to pass over to the opposite bank. And when the Egyptians try to follow, God allows the river to resume its normal course, swamps the Egyptian forces, and puts an end to their threat for good. Now, we haven't covered chapter 15, but I'm going to give you a massively quick whistle-stop tour. The highlights of it is Moses and people of God are rejoicing. They're rejoicing about God's victory over Pharaoh and over Egypt. And they are doing that by worshipping and singing songs in praise to God. But the Israelites soon grumble because they get thirsty in the wilderness. So God miraculously turns some bitter water into sweet water at a place called Marah. And then God leads them to an oasis in the wilderness called Elim, which had plenty of water and plenty of shade. And that whole journey has led us up to this point, the start of chapter 16. As I said, it's quite lengthy. We're not going to actually cover all of it word for word, but I have broken it down into 4 sections. And for your convenience and for my pernicketiness, each of those sections begins with P. Yeah, you like that, eh? Problem, promise, provision, and pointer. So, now that you're all suitably interested in my many P's. P number 1, the problem. So we're in chapter 16, Exodus 16. We're going to look at verses 1 to 3. We're going to think about what is the problem. I'll read the ESV version. So they set out from Elim. And all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Drama. So here's the problem then. The Israelites are hungry. Whatever provisions they carried with them from Egypt and through the Red Sea were now gone. And that is a problem. Because remember, the Bible tells us that at least 600,000 men have journeyed from Egypt. And that does not include the women and the children. So some estimates put it even more than twice that figure. That is a lot of mouths to feed, right? Even if you think they brought lots of provisions with them, that's still a lot of mouths to feed. But now these provisions are gone. How are they going to survive? The reality is the land itself cannot support them. They can't hunt there really. They can't farm there. It is a wilderness. And they're not exactly on good terms with the surrounding nations. So trade, not an option. What are they going to do about this problem? And I get it. It is a problem. They're hungry. Their kids are hungry and crying because their bellies are empty and aching. And you can imagine them going to their neighbour and saying, hey man, my kids are starving and they're crying out and I haven't eaten for days. Have you got anything? Have you got anything? And their friend says to them, me neither. I've got nothing. My kids are crying too. What are we going to do? I can't imagine what that must have been like. I'll tell you, I get hungry, or hangry as my wife calls it, if lunch is like half an hour late. To the point we might have to keep a Snickers in the car in case of emergencies. Yeah. But I joke, but this must have been terrifying, right? You look to the left and there's nothing. You look to the right, nothing. Where's their help going to come from? That is a problem. I say it's a problem because I don't think that in this context it's actually the problem. I think in this instance, the problem is not the situation that the people of God are facing, but the problem of their own faithless hearts. How quickly they've forgotten the Lord their God. The God who heard their cries in slavery. The God who raised up a leader to bring them out of it. The God who has demonstrated his sovereignty in the plagues and his power over life and death. The God who provided salvation through the blood of a lamb. The God who kept them from situations that weren't good for them and led them directly to this point. The God who even then, in this very place and moment, is faithfully fulfilling his promises to their forefathers. The God who parted the Red Sea and defeated the might of Egypt. The God they had just been worshipping and rejoicing over. The God whose very presence is with them in a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. The God who has just provided and proved his provision, lots of peace, over them by quenching their thirst miraculously at Marah. For goodness sake. Surely their first reaction in this moment, when they look at this problem, should be to fall to their knees and pray faith-filled prayers to the Lord God Almighty. Am I right?
Yeah.
But they don't. They grumble. They complain. And they moan. They turn on Moses and they turn on Aaron, the leaders that God has raised up for them. And the whole congregation immediately questions their leadership, condemns their direction, and accuses them of leading them in the wilderness just to die. They say, we were better off in Egypt. We'd have been better if God had killed us there with full bellies than die here with empty bellies in the wilderness. Pragmatically, if that were true, that is true, right? If they had been led there to die, you're better off dying with a full belly than an empty one. But in fairness, Moses and Aaron are only doing exactly what God has told them and instructed them to do. A fact that I find humorous that they take great care to repeatedly point out later in the text. So those of you with eagle ears, as I continue through, note how many times Moses points back to God and says, not mine, it's not me, it's it. But here's the thing, when they're attacking Moses and they're attacking Aaron, the problem is that Israelites are not just attacking those guys. In rejecting them and questioning their intention and integrity and attacking their leadership, they are implicitly rejecting and therefore attacking the one who has raised them up, given them authority to lead, and equipped them for this task. So the heart of the issue, the real problem, is that in their sinfulness, the people of God are fundamentally now questioning the integrity, the intention, and the authority of God himself. And that is the problem. And guys, I think this is still a genuine issue for us as human beings now. Because we're on a journey with Jesus, right? And we're following where he leads. And often he calls us to go without knowing the destination. Often he calls us to go without knowing how we're going to get there or what route we're going to take. And life can feel like we are just wandering in the wilderness sometimes. And although we face entirely different problems to the people of God then, the very real problem of our sinful heart attitudes is just the same. And it can often lead us to a place of questioning God, especially when things go wrong, when we face a problem. And if we're not careful, we can begin to grumble against our leaders and then against God. We say things like, why is this happening to me? Why have you led me here just to go through this, God? I was better off where I was before. Guys, when we do that, we're not just questioning God's leadership or the style of leadership or his decisions. We're actually calling into question his character. We call into question his love for us, his goodness, his righteousness, his sovereignty. Whereas in reality, the truth is, he is the same miraculous God of the Exodus that we've just been talking about. Yeah? He's the same God that has seen us as individuals through every situation and circumstance that we've faced in our lives so far. The same mighty God whose love, goodness, righteousness, mercy and sovereignty is eternal and unchanging. And therefore, he is the same God who is more than sufficient to provide for our needs both yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We may feel insignificant and small compared to the big problem at hand. But I want to remind you this morning out of this passage in Exodus that is the wrong perspective. It's only when we compare our big problem against our big, big God that we see it in its right perspective. Brothers and sisters, let us not forget who our God is and grumble against him. Instead, when we encounter a big problem, let's proclaim the glorious name of our big, big God and pray faith-filled prayers for provision. Amen? Back to the Israelites then. Incidentally, the name of the area where they are, where the narrative takes place, is the wilderness of sin. I got really excited when I read that. I was like, oh, that's deep. It's not. It's not even a little bit connected to our word for sin. So, i.e. missing the mark. But, nevertheless, there is a sort of poetic irony here in our English translations. Because here in the wilderness of sin, the grace of God is poured out on his sinful and undeserving people. Which leads me from the problem to the promise. So verses 4 to 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord." And then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, 'Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." Once again, God has heard the voice of his people. Not their cries of despair, as in Egypt, but this time they're grumbling, they're complaining, and they're moaning. Now, as a dad, one of the sounds I have the least tolerance, read 0 tolerance for, is the sound of my kids grumbling, complaining, and moaning. I want you to imagine this scenario. If you're a parent, you know exactly what I'm saying. If you're not a parent yet, wait for it. You've taken the family on holiday. You've bundled everyone in the car. You've had a 5-hour drive in traffic to the place that you're staying. You get in, you unpack the suitcase, you sit down, and you just get a cup of tea. And it's peace, and it's quiet, and it's holiday. And 15 seconds in, you hear the cursed words. "I'm bored!" I am ashamed to say that these words only provoke one response in me, and it is a sort of John Cleese temper tantrum, okay? "Right, that's it, pack the suitcases! Back in the car, the lot of you! I'll drop you off at the nearest activity centre and I'll pick you up in a week next Thursday. That's it." Is that true, Matt? No. Clearly, God's still got work to do in me and my heart. Clearly. But the point is, how do we think God, the Father, responds when his children moan at him, despite everything he's done for them? The answer is, he does what I struggle to do. And he responds with grace, with undeserved favour. And instead of losing his temper, God responds with a promise to miraculously provide both meat and bread for his people. But in terms of our list of P's, God's promise is a 2-for-1 deal. Because intertwined with his promise is the purpose of the whole situation. The reason that God's people have been brought to this very place and into this situation to face this problem is that God is testing them and reminding them of who he is. Verse 4, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." Verse 12, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." The Israelites are facing this problem of no food because God wants to use it as an opportunity for them to trust in his promises. And to know that he is the one whom they should be looking to for provision. Because he is their God and they are his people. Here and now, he wants to break the last clinging vestiges of their dependence and reliance on Egypt. The situation is this: they're unable to sustain themselves, and they are no longer able to rely on that parasitic support from Egypt. Therefore, they must put their trust in the God who promises provision. Brothers and sisters, the same is true of us. Sometimes God leads us into an area where we have to trust in his promises to us and to look to him alone for our provision, because he wants to break our dependence on anything else. Whether that's our self-reliance, I can provide for me, whether it's our dependence on our financial security, my money provides for me, or in our relationships, other people provide for me. Anything that would try to trump our trust in God cannot be allowed to stand. What that should do is give us a profound sense of encouragement. Because it means when we face these kinds of problems, we know there is a plan and a purpose. We know that God is at work breaking the parasitic holds on us that these things can have and liberating our hearts so we can fully and wholeheartedly trust in the promises of God. Amen?
Yes.
So from God's promise, let's move to God's provision. Verses 13 to 19. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine, flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer, according to the number of persons that each of you has in his tent." And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat, and Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it till the morning." I love this story because when God says something will happen, it is as certain as if that thing had already happened. That is how confident we can be. Book of Genesis says, God said, "Let there be light." There was light.
Yes.
God says, "I'm going to rain down manna from heaven and I'm going to give you meat to eat." And sure enough, there it is. When God says he's going to provide, guess what? He provides. In this case, when there's no earthly bread available, he is so committed to his word that he provides bread from heaven. Psalm 78 says, "And he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate the bread of the angels." What was that like? Exodus 16:31 says, "It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey." Sounds good. What an unparalleled privilege to be sustained day by day by the supernatural provision of God. And God's provision was so full and so total that even though he chose to work through the Israelites to gather that bread from the ground, no one had more than they needed, and no one had less than they needed. no matter how much they picked up. You can imagine that situation, can't you? You can imagine the one guy running around just grabbing loads of it in his bag and running back to his tent, probably thinking, I'm going to sell this off later. He had no more than he needed for his family. And the person that struggled to gather anything had everything they needed for his family. But God's provision here is fuller and more extravagant still. Because in true Yahweh, the one true God style, he not only rains down the bread of heaven, but he rains down meat in the form of quails. Again, Psalm 78 gives us some detail about the scale of God's abundant provision. It says he rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved. That's extravagant. God not only gave them what they needed to survive, but went above and beyond by blessing them with something they desired. And in doing so, he began to not only teach them obedience by regulating when and how they were supposed to collect that bread from heaven, but he unequivocally and extravagantly demonstrated he was the Lord their God, the one they were to look to each day for their provision. And that was a lesson they'd be reminded of each time they ate their daily bread. Remember that phrase. And guess what? Fast forward a few thousand years to today, nothing has changed for the people of God. Jesus teaches us to pray to God the Father, give us this day our daily bread. We are still to look to God as the sole provider of our daily needs. Now, the way we go about gathering that bread may be different now, because the manna stopped falling when the people of God entered the promised land. But the wellspring, the fountain, the source of our daily provision is still the Lord our God. And it is to him we are to look for our daily bread. But Jesus goes further and he applies a spiritual reality to this practice. In John chapter 6, Jesus says, "My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Jesus is saying that the bread the Israelites ate in the wilderness was only a taste, a hint, a picture of the real bread of heaven. You see, even though manna sustained the people of God in the wilderness and gave them life, it was only temporary. They were still hungry after they'd eaten that heavenly bread. They were still thirsty after they'd drunk the bitter water made sweet at Marah. Whereas Jesus says he alone is the true bread of life. He alone is the fullness and extravagance of God's provision for his people. He alone is the one who can satisfy our spiritual hunger and thirst, not just for a time, but for eternity. And what do we need to do to receive that provision? He says you just need to come to me and believe in me. As Christ followers, what that practically means is that not only should we look to God for our daily physical needs, but we also need to continue to come to him daily for our spiritual needs, to have our spiritual hunger sated and our thirst quenched by the heavenly bread of Jesus and the living water of the Spirit. Okay, lots of P's. Here's our final one. Pointer. Verse 32. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations," talking about manna, "so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." Now eventually that manna in a jar was kept next to the tablets in the ark. But God commands that a portion of this manna is put aside. Why? For the benefit of future generations. The reason for this is that God knows full well that as human beings, we are absolute wombles at forgetting the Lord our God and neglecting our relationship with Him. So He puts the heavenly bread aside as a symbol, a reminder of His promises, and a pointer to His what? Provision. And for us, this side of the cross, that symbol has been superseded by another and greater pointer. The bread of heaven given through Moses has been replaced by the bread of life given through Jesus. And its symbol, its sign, is the communion meal, which points to the cross of Christ. The place where God's promises and His purpose were outworked in the fullness and the extravagance of His provision over us as individuals in the person of Jesus, the bread of life, who was broken for me and for you. That's why whenever we share that communion meal together, we need to remember that it points to the God of the Exodus. And as I often say, we need to remember that we, therefore, are Exodus people. And that no matter how big a problem we face, we have a big, big God who is outworking His sovereign plans and purposes in our lives. And a big, big God who has promised to provide for all our physical and spiritual needs, both now and into eternity. And He has already fulfilled that promise in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And He is even now going about the business of outworking in each of our lives for our good and His glory. Amen? Yes. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up, and then I want to lead us in some response. I wasn't actually going to do a response today. I was thinking, let's just worship. I'm so excited to worship God. And I think that's true. We need to do that on the back of this word. But I think there may be people also this morning who have grumbled against God. In your heart you have said, "Why, God? Why have you led me here? Why have you let me go through this thing?" And in doing so, you have effectively said, "I don't think that you're for me. I don't think that I'm questioning your love for me at this point, God." And I'm not saying this because there's a condemnation over you for that. I'm saying this because you need to get that right with God. There's a moment to come before Him and say, "I'm sorry I questioned you, God. I'm sorry that I felt there was something wrong with your love over me." Because you know what? God is not like me when we moan. He doesn't get angry with us. He just meets us with His grace. And there's grace for you this morning. There's forgiveness and there's a going on with God. There's a new direction available. I also felt there were people here that were worried about provision. I don't know what that means in your context. I don't know. Maybe you're facing something incredibly big. And maybe your heart is stirred because you think, yeah, you're right, but we've got a big, big God. But you're still fearful about that. What I want to encourage you to do is to find somebody and pray together. Yes. Encourage one another. If you've got a word today of encouragement for God's church, come and see Kane at the front and share that during the worship time. Let's do that for one another. Let's build one another up and send one another out, encouraged and equipped, ready to face these problems in our lives. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So let's worship God, let's give him the glory that he's due, let's come to him in humility and ask forgiveness when we've got it wrong, and let's come to him and seek him faithfully for those problems in our lives of provision that we need his help. I hand over to the